You are about to discover one of World War II's most desperate naval operations. While everyone knows about submarine warfare and torpedo attacks, almost nobody talks about what happened when Japan's mighty submarine fleet got turned into underwater delivery trucks. This is the story of how elite submarines went from hunting Allied carriers to sneaking rice past enemy destroyers. And the submariners were not happy about it. By November 1942, everything was falling apart for Japan in the Pacific. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal, and thousands of Japanese soldiers were trapped on remote islands, cut off from resupply. American submarines were sinking cargo ships faster than they could be replaced. Surface ships trying to reach isolated garrisons faced constant air attacks. The Japanese high command faced a terrible choice: watch their soldiers starve, or try something unprecedented. The solution was radical. Take your most advanced attack submarines and turn them into cargo haulers. These subs would sneak past Allied blockades under darkness, surface near beaches, and unload whatever supplies they could carry. It was like using a sports car to haul groceries. Effective? Maybe. Dignified? Absolutely not. Starting in November 1942, 16 large I-boats were reassigned to what the Japanese called Mogura operations. Mogura means mole in Japanese, iwamamapis, fitting because these submarines would burrow through enemy waters like moles through dirt. During the Guadalcanal campaign, these 16 submarines delivered 1,500 tons of supplies. That sounds impressive until you realize a single cargo ship could carry 10 times that amount. But cargo ships kept getting sunk, so submarines it was. The submarine crews hated these missions. These men had trained for years to become elite naval warriors. They dreamed of sinking enemy battleships. Instead, they were hauling bags of rice and canned fish. Crew morale plummeted faster than a submarine doing an emergency dive. But orders were orders, and the Japanese military did not accept complaints. The logistics were mind-boggling. A standard fleet submarine could only carry about 50 tons of cargo if you removed the seaplane and modified the hangars. That was barely enough to feed 3,000 soldiers for 2 days. The Japanese needed to get creative, and creative they got. The Navy developed special floating containers called unkato. Picture a massive steel cigar, 135 feet long and 16 feet in diameter. These giants could hold 300 tons of cargo and were designed to be towed underwater by a submarine. The sub would drag this thing close to shore, release it, and hope it would float to the beach where soldiers could retrieve it. In theory, brilliant. In practice, most unkato never reached their destination. They would sink, drift away, or get spotted and attacked by patrol boats. Then there was the unpoto, which might be the strangest supply vehicle of the entire war. Imagine a flat cargo sled 71 feet long and 13 feet wide. Now strap 2 old torpedo bodies to it for propulsion. Loaded up with an infantry gun and 20 tons of ammunition. Have one brave crewman ride this contraption like the world's most dangerous surfboard. The unpoto could travel about 2 miles before running out of fuel, which meant the submarine had to get dangerously close to shore. The Japanese also tried using simple rubber containers that could be released while submerged. These containers held supplies wrapped in waterproof materials. The submarine would creep close at night and push containers out of torpedo tubes. The containers would float up and supposedly drift to shore. Allied coast watchers quickly figured this out and would wait for these container drops. Many floating supply bundles ended up machine-gunned or washed up on wrong beaches. By late 1944, Japan finally built purpose-designed supply submarines called the Hei 101 class. These were smaller, cheaper boats designed specifically for cargo hauling. Each could carry 60 tons of supplies. Japan planned to build 400 of them. They only completed 38 before the war ended. Most never even saw combat. Every resupply mission was a nightmare of danger and stress. Submarines approaching isolated garrisons had to navigate through what Americans called torpedo junction. Allied submarines, destroyers, and patrol boats were everywhere. Japanese subs had to surface to recharge batteries and navigate, making them vulnerable to aircraft. One mistake meant death. A typical resupply run went like this. A submarine would leave its base loaded down with supplies. Speed dropped because of extra weight. Maneuverability suffered. Diving took longer. Everything that made a submarine effective became compromised. The sub would creep through Allied waters, traveling submerged during the day and surfacing at night. As the submarine approached the target island, real danger began. Allied radio intelligence had gotten very good at predicting when and where these supply runs would happen. Patrol boats would set in ambushes. On one mission to Guadalcanal in January 1943, the submarine I-1 surfaced exactly where two New Zealand corvettes were waiting. The corvettes had been tipped off by intelligence. The I-1 never stood a chance. What happened next was brutal. The corvette Kiwi detected I-1 on sonar just as it raised its periscope. Depth charges forced I-1 to surface. Then Kiwi rammed the submarine, smashing into its hull. Machine gun fire raked the bridge. The commanding officer was killed almost immediately. Kiwi rammed I-1 again, punching holes in the ballast tanks. The submarine tried to beach itself but kept taking fire. Eventually, I-1 ran aground and had to be abandoned. The ship was carrying rubber containers loaded with rice, bean paste, curry, ham, and sausages for 3,000 men. None of it reached the garrison. This was not isolated. Throughout late 1942 and 1943, Japanese submarines attempting resupply were hunted relentlessly. PT boats prowled coastlines. Destroyers patrolled approaches. Allied aircraft with radar could detect surface submarines from miles away. As many as 25 Japanese submarines were lost during these resupply operations. That represented nearly 15% of the entire Japanese submarine fleet, lost not in glorious combat, but while hauling groceries. By September 1943, Japanese submarines had completed 95 supply runs to New Guinea alone, delivering 3,500 tons of cargo. Combined with Guadalcanal operations, submarines had hauled thousands of tons through enemy waters. On paper, this sounds like success. In reality, it was nowhere near enough. A typical isolated garrison needed tons of food per day just to survive. Ammunition requirements were enormous. Medical supplies were in constant demand. What submarines could carry was a drop in the ocean. The soldiers on these islands were still starving. They were still running out of bullets. They were still dying of disease. Meanwhile, the submarine force was hemorrhaging boats and experienced crews. Every submarine lost on a resupply mission was one less submarine available to attack Allied shipping. The strategic cost was staggering. Japanese submarines at the war's start had been highly effective, sinking 2 American aircraft carriers in 1942 alone. By 1943 and 1944, most submarines were either hauling supplies, getting sunk, or sitting in port with no fuel. The American submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping made everything worse. American subs sank over half of Japan's merchant fleet during the war. Every cargo ship sunk meant more pressure on submarines to fill the gap. It became a vicious cycle. Less merchant shipping meant more submarine supply missions. More supply missions meant more submarines lost. Less offensive operations meant Allied forces grew stronger. Japan started the war with 63 ocean-going submarines and built 111 more during the conflict. Of these 174 submarines, 128 were lost. That is a 73% loss rate. For comparison, American submarines had a 22% casualty rate. The Japanese submarine force essentially destroyed itself trying to maintain unsustainable supply lines to doomed garrisons. By 1944, the Japanese submarine force was a shadow of what it had been. Experienced crews were dead or reassigned. New submarines lacked proper training time. Allied anti-submarine warfare had become devastatingly effective with improved radar, sonar, and depth charges. And still, the supply missions continued because there was no alternative. The Hay 101 class supply submarines started entering service in late 1944 and early 1945. These were supposed to solve the resupply problem. They were cheap to build, small enough to be stealthy, and optimized for cargo capacity. But even these purpose-built supply boats faced overwhelming odds. Most Hay 101 submarines never made a successful supply run. Some were converted to other roles before deployment. Others were sunk on their first missions. A few survived long enough to surrender at war's end, having accomplished nothing of strategic value. The submarines that were supposed to save isolated garrisons ended up as forgotten footnotes, scuttled by American forces in 1946. The strategic failure was complete. Isolated garrisons like those on Guadalcanal were eventually evacuated or defeated despite submarine supply efforts. The supplies delivered were insufficient to change outcomes. The submarines lost represented capabilities that could have been used offensively. The entire resupply operation was a desperate gamble that failed. In the final months of the war, Japanese submarines were being used for increasingly bizarre missions. Some carried suicide torpedoes. Some were supposed to attack the Panama Canal with aircraft. The proud submarine force that had struck Pearl Harbor had been reduced to delivering supplies it could not adequately carry, to garrisons it could not save, through waters it could no longer safely navigate. Today, when people think about submarine warfare in World War II, they think about German U-boats in the Atlantic or American submarines hunting Japanese merchant ships. Almost nobody remembers the Japanese submarine supply missions. There are no dramatic movies about I-boats sneaking rice to Guadalcanal. No famous documentaries chronicle the unkato cargo containers. The whole operation has faded into obscurity. Yet these missions reveal something important about the Pacific War. They show how desperate Japan's strategic situation became. They demonstrate the impossible logistics of island warfare. They highlight the courage of submarine crews forced into missions they never trained for. These sailors knew the missions were probably futile. They went anyway. The supply missions also reveal a fundamental truth about naval warfare. Submarines are precision instruments designed for specific roles. Using them as cargo haulers is like using a sword to dig a ditch. Technically possible, incredibly inefficient, and likely to break your sword. Japan's submarine force was one of the most advanced in the world. Using it for supply runs was a strategic admission of defeat. The human cost was enormous. Thousands of submarine crew members died on these missions. Thousands more soldiers on isolated islands starved despite the submarine efforts. The supplies that did get through often arrived too late or in quantities too small to matter. For every successful supply run, there were multiple failures. The Japanese submarine resupply missions stand as one of history's most desperate logistical operations. They combined cutting-edge naval technology with primitive supply methods. Submarines worth millions were used to deliver bags of rice worth pennies. Advanced torpedoes were removed to make room for canned vegetables. It was industrial-age military power trying to solve medieval siege problems. The missions failed not because of lack of courage. Japanese submarine crews displayed remarkable bravery and skill. The missions failed because the entire strategic situation was impossible. No amount of submarine runs could have supplied tens of thousands of soldiers scattered across hundreds of Pacific islands. The American stranglehold on shipping lanes was too complete. Allied air and naval superiority was too overwhelming. What makes these missions historically significant is what they reveal about Japan's deteriorating position. When your Navy stops hunting enemy ships and starts delivering groceries, you are losing. When your most advanced weapons are used for supply runs, your strategy has collapsed. When experienced crews die hauling rice instead of fighting battles, your war effort is in terminal decline. The final irony is that Japan had the submarine technology to potentially be more effective in commerce raiding. Japanese torpedoes were better. Their submarines had longer range. Some could travel nearly 40,000 miles without refueling. But Japanese naval doctrine focused on fighting the enemy fleet rather than destroying merchant shipping. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. Modern military strategists study these missions as examples of what not to do. Do not use specialized assets for tasks they were not designed for. Do not sacrifice offensive capability for defensive supply operations. The Japanese submarine supply missions violated all these principles and paid the price. For the sailors who served on these missions, there was no glory and little recognition. They were not celebrated as heroes. Many died without their families knowing what mission they were on. The submarine supply runs were Japan's secret shame, a desperate gamble everyone wanted to forget. Yet in their failure, these missions tell us something profound. Courage and technology alone cannot overcome impossible strategic situations. The Japanese submariners who hauled supplies through enemy waters were trying to save their comrades, even when success was nearly impossible. That deserves to be remembered. Image generations.